Welcome back to Africa Update here on Trust Television, reaching you from Nigeria's capital, Abuja. I'm your host, Chiamaka Nwafo. Now, at least 42 protesters were in court in Uganda on Tuesday for offenses allegedly committed during a banned youth-led demonstration in the capital, Kampala. The young protesters had earlier on Tuesday marched on the city streets to denounce what they say are corruption and human rights abuses by lawmakers. Here's more from Africa News.
A Ugandan magistrate's court on Tuesday charged at least 42 protesters for offences allegedly committed during a banned youth-led demonstration in the capital, Kampala. The young protesters had earlier on Tuesday marched on the city's streets to denounce what they say are corruption and human rights abuses by lawmakers. The charges against the protesters outline offences including being idle and disorderly and being a common nuisance, a charge that has often been used by authorities to suppress protests. They pleaded not guilty and were ordered to return to court at different dates between July 30th and August 6th. Opposition leaders say embezzlement and misuse of government funds are widespread in Uganda and have long accused President Yoweri Museveni of failing to prosecute corrupt officials who are loyal to him. He has repeatedly denied condoning corruption. Human Rights Watch have accused the government of a lack of respect for people's right to protest.
It's a protest galore because over in Kenya was started as digital activism by young Kenyans on social media, raising their concerns over a government tax bill has developed into a movement that has forced President William Ruto to drop the bill and fire nearly his entire cabinet. Experts say the uprising of young people in Kenya could have ripple effects across Africa, the world's youngest continent. Juma Majanga reports from Nairobi for VOA.
Anti-government protests continue across Kenya for the fourth week running. The youth-led protests are organized largely on social media. They were initially sparked by a controversial tax bill. President William Ruto has since withdrawn the bill and fired nearly his entire cabinet. But the protesters are demanding more, including an end to corruption and for Ruto to step down.
The call for Ruto to go is a clarion call that calls upon the leadership of this nation to really listen to what the young people are saying, not hearing, intentionally listening to what they are saying. They are saying, hey, we have certain things that we feel that they are not going on well in a matter that we appreciate, and they are saying now we have an opportunity to lead this conversation.
Socio-political protests are not new in Kenya, but in the past, they were led by politicians and their supporters. Analysts say this time is different.
It was about things going wrong in the country and the youth taking position and saying they have to do something about it.
The Kenyan police have been accused of excessive force in handling the protests, which were seen as mostly peaceful when they started. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights says at least 50 protesters have been killed. The Law Society of Kenya says it is seeking justice in the courts for victims of alleged police brutality and is urging President Ruto to initiate reforms.
I feel like we're in a constitutional moment, and I think the president should not take it negatively because he's not solely the reason for why we're in this constitutional moment. The question of corruption over years, the question of lack of adequate health care, proper education systems, these are things that have built over time that people are clamoring and saying enough is enough. Let us hold public officers accountable.
Munene says other African countries are keenly watching the events in Kenya as the impact could spread across the continent.
The rumblings are there. And so it's a lesson to the various governments not to let things boil to a point like this one. Because the warnings in Kenya were there. Many people kept on saying there is a problem here. There is a problem here. but it was ignored.
Analysts say it is now up to leaders to learn and to do something about it.
Still in Kenya, reactions. Due to that protest, Kenyan President William Ruto on Wednesday, July 24, has named 4 ministers from the main opposition party in a bid to form a broad-based government. Hassan Joho was nominated as Cabinet Secretary for Mining, Blue Economy and Maritime Affairs. Wycliffe Oparanya was designated as Cabinet Secretary for Cooperatives, John Mbadi at the National Treasury Ministry, and Opio Wandai at Energy. Let's take a look.
Kenyan President William Ruto on Wednesday named 4 ministers from the main opposition party in a bid to form a broad-based government. Hassan Joho was nominated as Cabinet Secretary for Mining. Wycliffe Oparanya was designated as Cabinet Secretary for Cooperatives. John Mbadi was appointed at the National Treasury Ministry, and Opio Wandai at Energy. The 4 politicians were part of a batch of 10 nominees. They are close allies of the Orange Democratic Movement leader Raila Odinga. This comes despite a warning by Odinga. In his first batch of appointments, Kenya's president retained 6 former cabinet ministers. Protesters on social media accused the opposition of treason, some alleging a secret deal has been brokered. The nominees still need to get the green light by Parliament, though. The weeks of turmoil in East Africa's economic hub have led to dozens of deaths and calls for Ruto's resignation. Protests began with Kenyans rejecting a proposed bill to impose more taxes as millions in the country barely get by amid rising prices.
Let's go over to Niger, where 1 year has passed since mutinous soldiers overthrew Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum. Coup leaders said they deposed the elected government for 2 key reasons: its security and economic crisis. But those challenges have not only persisted, they've worsened. Here is more from Africa News.
Nearly everything has stayed the same in Niger from a year ago except the country's rulers. Economic hardship remains, with ordinary people struggling to buy food, and a security crisis continues to unfold with near-daily attacks by Islamist insurgents. The market is really not affordable. Now just a cup of millet costs 1,250 francs, something that used to cost 1,000 before. Also, the price of rice has increased. Our main difficulty right now is the high cost of food on the market. We really want prices to drop. Otherwise, we thank God. May Allah bring us peace and security in our country. Restoring security and easing an economic crisis are the 2 key reasons given by Niger's generals for overthrowing President Mohamed Bazoum last July. Those challenges have not only persisted, they have worsened. Since the events of July 26th, many Nigerians have seen this situation impact their cost of living. Many have found themselves out of work. We can imagine the ordeal that these heads of family are experiencing with the soaring prices. On the streets of Niamey, the euphoria that greeted the coup leaders is quickly turning into frustration. But the country can expect relief from oil exports and the removal of ECOWAS sanctions.
Over in Sierra Leone, a court has found 11 people guilty of treason and other offences following what authorities have called an attempted coup, with their leader sentenced to almost 200 years in prison. We have more from Africa News.
A Sierra Leone court found 11 guilty of treason and other offences following what authorities have called an attempted coup, with their leader sentenced to almost 200 years in prison, a judiciary spokesperson said Tuesday. In November, dozens of gunmen broke into the country's armory, into a prison where the majority of more than 2,000 inmates were freed. The clashes left 18 security forces dead. Authorities at the time said they arrested around 80 suspects, and a dozen were charged in January, including former President Ernest Bai Koroma, later granted medical leave. The man accused of leading the attack, Amadou Koita Makolo, was sentenced Monday to 182 years in prison on charges of treason, murder, and shooting with intent to murder. Sierra Leone is still healing from an 11-year civil war that ended more than 2 decades ago, and its population of 8 million people is among the poorest in the world.
When we return from the break, we'll tell you how Kenyan farmers are turning sustainable methods to combat soil acidity. To stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Africa Update here on Trust Television, where we give you updates on what's happening on our beautiful motherland, black continent, Africa. Now, in an effort to combat increasingly acidic soil, farmers in Kenya are turning away from industrial farming methods. Planting vegetables, Benson Wanjala and his wife are working to cultivate their 2-acre plot of land on the outskirts of Nairobi. Here's more.
In an effort to combat increasingly acidic soil, farmers in Kenya are turning away from industrial farming methods. Farmer Benson Wanjala has seen the effect of chemical fertilizers on his crop yield. I was advised to apply manure, but I wasn't keeping cows at the time. Since I was wondering why the yield had reduced, I decided to move to Nairobi and start farming vegetables. My vegetable yield also began to decrease, and I suspect it is due to the increased amount of chemicals in the soil. I have no choice but to use fertilizers, as I need to make money to support my children. The overuse of chemical fertilizers changes the soil's acidity levels, leading to plants being unable to absorb the existing nutrients in the soil. Unaware of the consequences, many farmers double their fertilizer application when they get low yields. But soil testing can help them understand how to better use fertilizers and protect their land.
The farmers that are using chemical fertilizers now are maybe 2 generations into using chemical fertilizers, and before they weren't using it. So they don't have the data that would then inform them on how to use them. And who brings the chemical fertilizers? It's the companies that sell them. So their agenda is to push as much chemical fertilizers for sale.
With Kenya's maize production down in recent years, experts are calling for sustainable farming practices and the use of biofertilizers to stop soil degradation.
These microorganisms are killed, then clearly it's like saying that a human being without an immune system. You cannot be able, it's like a lifeless body. So like that's what our soils are right now. They don't have structure. They don't have enough microorganisms in the soil to help in nutrient cycling. So we have soils, but our production continues to go down.
Greenpeace Africa is urging governments across the continent to enact laws that support sustainable farming methods in a bid to counter declining yields.
Still in Kenya, an entrepreneur is helping people in wheelchairs get around in a country that is hard for people with disabilities to navigate. Through his company, Ace Mobility, users can hail cars and drivers equipped to accommodate disabled passengers. Victoria Amunga reports from Nairobi.
The hustle and bustle of Kenya's public transportation is escalating as the population grows, but this sector is usually unforgiving for persons with disabilities. Brian Ndiritu is a corporate communications graduate who was born disabled. He says his mobility challenges complicate access to public buses and cabs.
It takes a lot of time to onboard, alight. So, you see, there's the whole planning. Sometimes drivers will just say, we won't carry you because, you are a burden.
A burden that Kenyan startup Ace Mobility is helping to lift through the vehicles that are designed to accommodate disabled passengers. The cars are fitted with a ramp that lifts wheelchairs by remote control. The drivers are also trained as caregivers for passengers with special needs, like Ndiritu.
I know that my wheelchair is safe because I'm not coming off my wheelchair. My wheelchair is safe, the travel is safe, the driver is conscious that I'm a person with disability. So there are some discussions I might not be comfortable with. Maybe the cause of my disability my private life.
Users are linked to drivers through a mobile app for $1 a kilometer. At least 500 people have downloaded the app, according to co-founder Daniel Kamau. He explains that their fleet of 15 cars are modified to include swivel seats that can be lowered to the ground, especially for the elderly when boarding the vehicles.
We're seeing a lot of interest from the conferences and summit industries. We're looking at more interest within the entertainment industry. We're also seeing normal and day-to-day commute, and also from the employer's point of view, who are now in a push to serve and employ more people with reduced mobilities.
Kenya's 2003 Persons with Disabilities Act prohibits the denial of services, education and job opportunities to people dealing with handicaps. But Kenya's National Council for Persons with Disabilities say improper infrastructure still prevents their full inclusion in society.
The public transport in Kenya is owned by private entities, so sometimes it is difficult for them to provide effective service delivery to persons with disabilities, because for them, as private entity, they consider any accommodation for persons with disability as an expense.
Transportation experts say insufficient funding has slowed down the adoption of most mobility solutions in Africa. S-Mobility was invited to pitch its business to investors at a summit in October hosted by the VUCA Group.
We're matching those types of projects with the funding, whether it's venture capital, banks, DFIs, and so on and so forth, matching them with entities that have the funding to be able to invest into these solutions so that they can get off the ground and be scaled.
Authorities say technologies like S-Mobility can help the millions of Kenyans with disabilities live easier lives.
Still staying in East Africa, over in Uganda, a non-profit group in rural parts of the country is highlighting the issue of domestic violence through education and conflict resolution. Local non-profit Uganda says domestic violence is so widespread that it's hard to find a woman who isn't affected. Here's more from African News.
A local non-profit in rural Uganda says that domestic violence is so widespread that it's hard to find a woman who isn't affected. Uganda, which is affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, aims to educate communities and uses staged performances to highlight the crisis.
When people are in the vicious circle of poverty, violence tends to be so rampant because these people lack basic needs of life, where we find the food, clothes, school fees, the shelter, and the other things that are so important in life. And as a result, the two have to disagree. And from a disagreement, just expect fights.
Uganda works with perpetrators and victims by offering education on conflict resolution. One day I came back from drinking and using drugs, and when I got home I asked my wife for food, and she told me there was no food. I got angry and started beating her, and in the process I also beat up my son and harmed him. I was reprimanded for what I did, and now I know alcohol is the cause of all evil. The non-profit also runs separate programs for men and women, with its Soul Sisters clubs bringing together women to support victims of domestic violence.
We realized that some women keep quiet with their problems in homes unless they get somebody to support them, to move with them to the next level. Like, for example, those Soul Sisters, they say, no, if it means we can offer transport for you, with you, we go to court together, we go to the local council one together, then they give these women courage to speak out.
The reason why I became a member, because it helped me, and I'm now settled. I also want to help those people who are in the same problem like I faced in the past.
A 2020 UN-backed survey found that 95% of Ugandan women and girls had experienced physical or sexual violence or both after turning 15.
And finally, Experts warn that the African penguin could be extinct in the wild by 2035. That's why two environmental groups are taking legal action against the South African government to help save this species. Reporter Vicky Stark in Cape Town, South Africa, has more.
The African penguin is the only penguin that lives and breeds exclusively in Africa. Sadly, this tuxedoed bird could be extinct in a decade. The latest census, done last year, reveals less than 10,000 breeding pairs left in the wild. Most of these, just over 8,300, are in South Africa, down from just over 27,100 in 2008. To stop the decline, the Southern African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds, or SANCOB, and fellow conservation group BirdLife South Africa, represented by the Biodiversity Law Centre, are waging a legal battle to get wider, more meaningful fishing restrictions.
African penguins are specialist feeders, so they feed on sardine and anchovy, but it also means that they're in direct competition with the purse seine fishing industry.
In August last year, former Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, Barbara Creasy, announced that 6 no-take fishing zones, officially introduced at the main penguin breeding colonies in 2022, would remain in place until 2033. These extend to an almost 12.5-mile radius, which scientists have found to be beneficial, particularly during breeding. However, SANCOB says an international panel of experts appointed by the minister 2 years ago recommended an additional measure of mapping out where the penguins find their food so that these areas can also be protected.
She hasn't implemented that recommendation, so she hasn't reduced the competition between the fisheries industry and the penguins.
In response to VOA's request for comment on the court case, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment spokesperson, Peter Mbelengwa, said that the matter is ongoing and is set to be heard at the North Gauteng High Court in October. Meanwhile, as the wheels of justice turn, SANCOB is fundraising to expand the chick rearing unit at its centre in Tableview, Cape Town. It currently takes in around 400 abandoned eggs and up to 600 abandoned chicks each year. Reasons for parents leaving include food shortages or extreme weather conditions like heat waves or flooding.
The new chick rearing unit will allow us to accept more eggs from the colonies because it just provides us with more space to hold more group up incubators so that we can hatch more eggs.
They need $14,000 to finish building the new unit, where chicks like these will receive the best care and eventually be released back into the wild.
And that's the size of our package for you today on Africa Update. I hope you've been enlightened, informed, and educated. For more of our programs, documentaries, and news, please do to follow us on all our social media platforms and on our YouTube live stream. I am Chiamaka Nwafo. Same place, same time next week. Bye.